I did a PhD in foresight and sociology of globalization in Australia. I've been a researcher in the field of strategic foresight and a facilitator since about 2002. I've lectured in many different places. I did a stint at the Lee Kuan Yew School, Swinburne, University of Sunshine Coast, Victoria University. I've done a lot of writing in this area, and I also am the senior consulting editor for the Journal of Future Studies. I'm Mexican. My parents emigrated from Mexico to the United States when they were quite young. I was born in California. I've lived in Japan and Taiwan and Spain, and I met my now wife in Taiwan, and we live in Australia. So just a little bit about me. So what is strategic foresight? It's these three things. The ability to identify and understand a landscape of social change and use this in organizationally useful ways. The ability to question our deep assumptions about the future, our images of the future, and develop better assumptions. We have images of the future in our mind, and we can consider those as collections of assumptions. When we think of an image of the future in our minds, it's not just one assumption. It's a whole number of assumptions that are actually kind of packed together. And finally, the ability to respond to this new understanding of the future through sensible and strategic action. And that could be through policy change, it could be through experimentation, social innovation, a number of different ways. What is anticipatory governance? Anticipatory governance denotes collaborative and participatory processes between governments and between government and civil sector, or NGOs, or intergovernmental organizations, for exploring and envisioning the future, for direction setting and developing strategy, and for experimentation and social innovation. It allows a region at any scale to harness the collective intelligence and wisdom of collaborating organizations and citizens. That's a really important point. It's not about one organization doing it on its own. It's about harnessing collective intelligence, meaning multiple organizations and people bring their knowledge together. And we've heard this idea that the sum is greater than the parts, right? Right? So like when we think about a car, if somebody just gave you a wheel, you wouldn't have much use for it, right? Or someone just gave you a steering wheel, it's not going to have much use for a steering wheel. It's when all those parts come together, right, that we can actually use it as a car. And that's the idea. Collective intelligence is about bringing all of the knowledges necessary from different organizations, people together, so that the sum is greater than the parts. And so that we can deal with strategic risks and leverage emerging opportunities. But why anticipatory governance? What's the rationale for it? So today we see an increased complexity of change in speed, interconnectedness, and uncertainty. We have strategic risks and wicked systemic problems. They're like knots. When someone does a knot, right? Something's caught in a knot, and we're trying to pull it apart. It's really hard, right? We have to sit down. We have to just pick away with our fingers. And if we pull harder, what happens? It gets tighter, right? You can't just pull harder at the knot, right? You have to look at the knot, and you have to understand, how is this thread stuck here and there? And then you're patient, and you pull it apart, right? We've got issues like climate change, automation, artificial intelligence, emerging diseases. And government's been good at dealing with social issues and problems which are static, which don't move and don't change quickly, and which can be dispatched in silos. But what about change, which is dynamic and complex and moving? So I want to introduce this idea of post-normal times. This is an idea that's been used by people in the future studies foresight field over the last 5 to 7 years. And I have a colleague named John Sweeney and Zia Sardar who've sort of championed this thinking. So post-normal times are characterized by issues that defy normal behavior and defy normal categories. It signals an in-between period between orthodoxies, where the rules of the past don't hold so much, but a new order hasn't quite emerged yet. And so this elicits excitement in some people, and in other people it elicits terror. And I think that terror aspect's quite important too, and we'll get into it. We have these things that are happening right now. We have globalization, this deep interconnectedness. We have the network world, right, built on information technology, digitization, and acceleration. We have laboratories around the world that are accelerating technology. And we've got these interacting forces. As Ban Ki-moon said, we're living through an era like no other. There are multiple crises: a food crisis, fuel crises, flu crises, financial crises. Each is a crisis we have not seen for many years, even generations, but this time they are hitting the world all at once. So this is the challenge that we have. And I can hear the siren in the background makes it even more ominous. So it sounds like we should all escape. Okay. So the post-normal times and post-normal condition, this is what changes for us. The scale changes, so it's not just confined to regions and nations. We're now interconnected globally. The scope changes. It's not just one issue. It's not just water. It's how water's connected with food. It's how food's connected with work. It's how work is connected with other issues. It's speed, and it's the simultaneity of the way change actually happens. So post-normal behavior, what does that mean? Well, digital, the speed and spread of memes, ideas across countries and cultures, K-pop moving around the world, rap culture, screen addiction, right? We have strict limits on my 12-year-old boy, how much screen time he gets to have every day and on the weekends, which is always a very tough thing to manage. But we've had this new technological challenge foisted upon all these new mothers and fathers that have to now deal with this new world. We've got climate. We have the non-linear effects of climate. Climate is not a linear phenomenon. And the non-linear effects of Greta Thunberg. So we have responses that are non-linear, where you have people that are spreading change in a non-linear way. We have economic behavior which is changing, the speed and the scope of financial contagions, like the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis. We have ecosystem behavior changing, the movement of invasive species, health issues, disease dynamics, as we're seeing today. So just thinking about coronavirus, which is the latest sort of major global issue that we're facing. This is a flu that may have taken years to go around the world, like the Spanish flu, which now just takes hours. It moves to multiple countries almost invisibly and simultaneously. But the flip side of that is that a flu that would have taken years or decades to have a vaccine has been open sourced. So the Chinese government made sure that the DNA code for the virus was available to researchers around the world very quickly. This is the fastest it's ever happened. And so now we have real-time phylogenetics and hundreds of labs around the world working on a solution. So we have these multiple things in this post-normal world working, both threats, but also the way that we can respond. There's also post-normal categories of change. Intelligence is no longer the providence of humans. We have artificial intelligence, algorithms, machine learning. Rights are no longer just human rights. They're earth rights, or the rights of rivers, or dolphins, or ecosystems, and in many places protected by lawyers. The management of ecosystems is no longer national. We manage the planetary biosphere together. And the future of work is not just discussed as industrial change. The future of work used to just be discussed as new industries, right? Now it's the end of employment, with people exploring things like universal basic income. We're also fundamentally between orthodoxies. We have the relative decline of the US and the West relative to China, Asia, and BRIC nations. We have the end of neoliberal orthodoxy, the Washington Consensus, but it's unclear what political economy will supplant this. We have economic liberalization in India, China, and many other nations, but it's unclear what the future model is. And we have the limits of the nation state to deal with global scale problems. We have tax havens, an international mafia, climate, an emerging slave trade, nuclear proliferation. And so we're in a space where the category of the nation is being challenged as a manager of our planetary existence. And so what this creates is existential terror, the existential terror of the post-normal world, meaning that instead of engaging with this, people use defense mechanisms to cope with them. And so what we're seeing today is that in many countries, and I don't have to name them, but you know them, we're seeing people use denial or minimization. Conspiracy theories, right? Climate change is a hoax. Entertainment, I'm just going to bury my head in Netflix. I do that plenty of times, by the way, so it's not all bad. Right? Othering, creating enemies. Nostalgic, back to the past reactions. Let's go back to the 1950s. These are the defense mechanisms when people are terrified of the post-normal world. And these coping mechanisms are like a drug. They make people feel good, but the problem remains unaddressed and the problem gets bigger, right? If we cope through our problems with drugs, the problem gets bigger and bigger. Yeah. David Hicks is an educator in future studies from Bath Spa University. And he said that people go through these 5 stages when they begin to experience global futures in post-normal worlds. The cognitive is overwhelmed by facts, too much going on in the head. The affective is how you feel, right? Sometimes we feel overwhelmed or frustrated, or we could even feel excited. The existential is when we begin to question who we are and how we've been operating. The empowerment is beginning to find pathways of change and pathways of hope, identifying new pathways. That's similar to the experimentation portfolio that the UNDP is developing. And then action dimension is the actual embeddedness in action networks, in processes of change. And the interesting thing that David Hicks said is that if we do not have the empowerment and the action, then people cannot rethink who they are in the context of this world. If we do not have empowered ways forward, then we're more likely to slide back into the past and to go into that terror, that denial, that othering, that making enemies. And so this is why empowerment and action is so crucial. In the face of the big challenges that we're facing, we actually have to find empowered ways forward that are viable. In Australia, it's criminal negligence because companies are now being sued for their actions on climate change. Small or manageable problems of today, when they're unaddressed, they become wicked, messy, overwhelming problems of the future. And our children, our future generations, will inherit the consequences of our decisions and our behavior. So, let's talk really quick now about anticipatory governance. So that's the why. That's the why, anticipatory governance. Right? So this is a little bit about what it is. And this I really have to thank Ida, Luong, Lan, UNDP team, because I'm learning from you all. Right? So I really appreciate this. I didn't hear about the 3 A's, and when I heard the 3 A's, I said, yay, 3 A's. Because we're always hearing about AAA ratings for countries, right? You're a AAA rated country or a municipality. You know, you've got a perfect credit rating. That's all about financialization, right? How much a municipality can borrow. This is the new 3 A's. Anticipatory, the ability to anticipate problems and issues before they become wicked or costly. Agile, the ability to question and rethink our assumptions about the future quickly. Adaptive, the ability to mobilize commitment and resources to respond to future challenges and opportunities. What is anticipation? It includes scanning for weak signals and empirical trends. And there's lots of techniques, there's lots of social science around this. It's reviewing and challenging old assumptions. That's really critical. It's about assumptions that we hold in our minds. Generating new hypotheses about social change and future scenarios. And making it relevant to organizations and institutions. Right? If it's not relevant, it just doesn't matter. It's just science fiction, which is good, but not this. Agility. The speed from identification of an issue to analysis. I've identified an issue, how fast am I now understanding it? Mindset shift and unlearning. The speed at which a community, an organization, or institution can change, rethink its assumptions about the future. How fast can we rethink our assumptions? We can see how difficult this is with in Anglo countries with climate change. Anglo countries have a climate change problem because in each country you have conservatives who are wedded to this old assumption about the future. And they're holding back the ability for their countries and the world to address the change. The speed from insight and understanding to communication. How fast can we go from the insight and the understanding to communicating it with people? That's agility too. And the speed from all of the above to decision making and mobilizing action. And finally, adaptive capacity. The ability to mobilize resources to address an emerging issue. How do we mobilize the resources that we need? The ability to communicate and mobilize an ecosystem of people and organizations to address an issue. It's not just our organization, it's how we reach out, create networks, create an ecosystem of change. The ability to generate viable ideas for addressing an issue. We have to be able to come up with ideas, new ideas. Right? So this is about ideation. It's about the idea to think in new ways and come up with solutions that hadn't existed before. The capacity to turn ideas into action plans and experiments. It's not just enough to have ideas. You've got to translate the ideas into plans and experiments that align with the goals. And the capacity to evaluate experiments, scale the experiments that have the most promise. So it's just not enough to do an experiment. Experiment's great, but if it's working, you've got to scale it. You've got to have the strategic planners on board to move it from great idea to we're going to do this nationwide. And then that's how you mobilize change. Okay, so now I want to go into some examples of anticipatory governance with some connections with experimentation. This is a decision-making framework that was developed by Jeff Mulligan, who used to be at Nesta. He wrote the book, The Art of Public Strategy, which is a fantastic book on public strategy, and Stafford Beer, who was the man who developed Viable Systems Model. So this is kind of drawn on both of them. There are 5 key value propositions for bringing strategic foresight and anticipatory governance in. So these are the 5 big ones. Number 1 is mapping horizons. Understanding the landscape of change. Pure and simple, right? What might happen in 10 years, 5 years, 20 years? What are the disruptors? Creating purpose is number 2. Reimagining and creating a preferred vision of the future. We actually have to have visions that guide us, that anchor us. And charting pathways. Charting pathways is generating the strategies to get from point A to point B. Testing ideas. Proposing a particular solution or idea and see if it works in a hypothetical scenario or in the present. That can be experimenting. And mobilizing action. Bring together the people, the organizations, and the resources to tackle future challenges. So here are a couple of examples. So mapping horizons. This is all about deepening the awareness of the change that's happening around us. So in Singapore, in 2007 or 8, they created the Risk Assessment Horizon Scanning System. And it was basically an all-of-government system to aggregate data from different ministries, from different departments, and pull that data together, and then analyze it to create emerging insights. Singapore had been doing scenario planning for many decades, and the scenario planning exercises had been useful. But what they found was they were getting hit by surprises. There was Jamaah Islamiyah, there was SARS, and there was the Asian financial crisis. And after that, they basically said, we want to be scanning for change all the time, and we want to understand the threats before they become overwhelming threats. Here's a quote from Peter Ho. He's the head of was the head of the civil service in Singapore, and some of you probably know him. He said, "We are no longer operating just in the simple or complicated spaces, where events were more predictable and the causes and effects were clearer. Instead, we were operating in complex and chaotic domains, where the first to discern patterns out of chaos would have the competitive advantage." Creating purpose. Purpose is all about the vision of the future that we aspire to, that we care about. Right? These activities also involve examining and reframing deep-seated cultural and organizational assumptions. So my PhD supervisor and futurist, Sohail Inayatullah, he does work all over the world, and this, like I do. He did a project with BRAC University. BRAC is the biggest development organization in the world, as you know. And they've done incredible work in eradicating poverty. And they have a university. And the university was at a crossroads. The university didn't know whether it wanted to be like the big global universities, or was it going to be the humble university of Bangladesh that's going to stick to its roots in development. And so they used a workshop with him to explore these issues, and they created scenarios of the future and came to a really deeply rich purpose. Right? And they decided to incorporate both. They said, we're gonna remain true to our roots, right, and work for the most disadvantaged. We're also going to incorporate all of the new technologies that we need to incorporate. Charting pathways. Charting pathways is about going from, okay, there's point A, how do we get from point A to point B? If our vision is B, how do we get there? That's the charting pathways. High-level strategies, socially acceptable pathways for desired change. So, in New Zealand, there's a city called Christchurch that got hit by 2 massive earthquakes in 2010 and 2011 that pretty much destroyed the city. All of the key functions of the city were out. They had no electricity, no water. A good portion of the town was destroyed. And in the wake of that, futurist Stephanie Pride, with others in New Zealand, and in collaboration with the Institute for the Future in California, used a thing called the Foresight Engine. And the Foresight Engine is a massive online role-play game. And what it does is allow people to play a game online to generate ideas. And so they had about 900 players. They had 900 players from around the world generate about 8,500 micro forecasts to generate images of the future of Christchurch and how Christchurch could recover from the earthquake. So it was a crowdsourcing effort to draw ideas in, both locally, nationally in New Zealand, but also globally. Mobilizing action. So strategic foresight can be used as a process to mobilize collaborative action and distributed innovation across organizations and community. It can involve supporting citizens in a wider range of organizations to initiate and drive social innovations, community enterprise, or change campaigns. So in Northern Europe, there's a process called transition management. This is one of the best processes around. It's been done in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Denmark, and Germany. So it's predominantly a sort of a Northern European thing. Basically, the process is they develop high-level, long-term goals of sustainable development in the 20 to 30-year time frame or longer. Then they develop coalitions between government, between civil society, and business. And those coalitions become the ground bed of developing social innovations. And then they open it up to the wider community. They say, okay, well, this is the framework for change. Go out and go do it. And they involve thousands of people in their communities in doing the actual events and social innovation that align with the long-term development challenges. There's also testing ideas. And testing ideas can be used to generate feedback and learning about a specific idea of the future, a scenario or a prototype. They can produce novel insights as people interact with experiments that enable people to interrogate the desirability of that future. And also to stress test experiments and consider potential unintended consequences. So a project that I did with a state government department in Victoria in Australia was the Department of Environment, Land, Water, and Planning. They wanted to create interventions in the context of a 10-year time frame And so what we did is we created a regular scenario and a downside scenario for that department. And then they developed, across their departments, 10 interventions. And then we stress test the interventions against the scenarios. We said, do your interventions stack up to the future? Will they address future challenges? And interestingly, one of the purposes of that project was to get the different people in the department together to talk about their knowledge of the future. Because the people in water had knowledge of water futures, and the people in forests had knowledge of forest futures. And the people in planning had knowledge of planning futures, but they weren't talking to each other. They actually hadn't made those connections. And so we used that opportunity for them to learn from each other. They then developed interventions, and then we tested those interventions against a 10-year future to see, are your policies, are your strategies, are your intervention ideas actually going to address those future scenarios and the challenges which they imply? In our scenarios, we forecasted megafires in 2021 in that report, right? And it wasn't, I can't take credit for it. We drew upon the knowledge of that organization. They had a lot of data. And the forest people knew the forests were getting drier. They knew that the fragility in the system was increasing, right? And what do we have in 2020? We had fires that wiped out 20% of the forest in Australia. Okay, here's another interesting example. This is anticipatory governance in Finland. And this is from the Finnish Prime Minister's office. Our operating environment is changing fast. Future challenges will be multidimensional and interdependent. We live in a world in which decision-making requires a broad understanding of complex wholes. Not just complexity, complex wholes. I like the language. Foresight activities which sketch out future development paths represent an attempt to satisfy the need for such knowledge. So in Finland, they have very strong commitment at a governmental level to applying strategic foresight. It contains strategic issues relative to policy decisions in a 10 to 20 year period. So it's an institutionalized process of having, at the Prime Minister's level, deep reflection on future changes and its implications for Finland. And the report process also involves Parliament. I quote, "The government report on the future serves to open discussion in the years ahead on potential solutions to the challenges posed by the transformation of work. The purpose is to generate information on the meaning of the transformation of work and how we can adapt to the changes successfully." And also this is done at the ministerial level. Ministries put together reports. It's led by permanent secretaries. And this is aggregated by the Prime Minister's office. And they also have a national network for foresight cooperation. So it's very robust. So this is being done in many places around the world, but with many different strategies. Every context is different. What works in Finland is not going to work in Vietnam. What works in Singapore is not going to work in Vietnam, right? You've got to tailor the approach to who you are. What's going to work for you? What are your challenges? What are your needs? That's what day 2 is all about. And who's involved? If we did a who thing, well, it could be a single government department. It could be collaborating government departments. It could be the whole government. It could be government plus NGOs and intergovernmental organizations. It could be government civil sector, civil society, the public. There's many combinations of this. There is not a one-size-fits-all.